And we're live. We're back on. It has been a couple weeks, but we are back. It is the Fantasy Football Forum, and we are talking. It is week 7. Look ahead, but we have some week 6 items we learned from games that we've saw in week 6. I again am joined by my wonderful co-host out on the sunny shores of California, where it's about the same temperature all year round. So we are all getting ready for fall and winter in most of the United States. But yeah, California is kind of seeing the same winter. So Grant, how have you been? How are you doing?
Yeah, things are good, Jeff. Just living the dream and going to the occasional Chargers game and watching them lose. So and watching the opposing team come and infiltrate the home stadium. So yeah, no, good times.
I'll
So
say
yeah, it's been
you.
good and it's been fun year so far.
Yeah, you were at the stadium where the gal with the meme now was created on Monday night. So you were live at
Hmm.
that game where that was happening. So must have been fun seeing
Yes,
history, at least something fun come out of that game.
yes, you're right.
We'll get to pick on the Chargers and Brandon Staley a whole lot, but let's take a look back at week 6. And typically we've done a singular game that we look and what did we learn from this past week. But I want to kind of take this was for some a week where it was kind of the worst case scenario where lower scoring games, teams that were put on upset alert, and there are also now no undefeated teams, meaning I believe it's what the 72 Dolphins are now able to
That's
pop
right.
their champagne again, and they're able to toast to a yet another perfect season. So they don't have to wait too long this year again. So looking specifically, I want to take a look kind of at Philadelphia and the 49ers. The last two of the remaining undefeated teams fall this last weekend. Um, if we look historically at the league right now, some of the data points that we see, scoring is down. And I think we're all starting to kind of feel that on our fantasy scores from players. Explosive plays are also down. We have gotten used to the high scoring and high plays, the big explosive fun plays. We got used to that in 2020, but over the league, it is down since 2020. It's down by half a touchdown per league or per team, I should say. So we're kind of seeing a shift of we saw it was kind of brought out originally with the Patrick Mahomes and Sean McVay Rams early on in their careers years ago, where we were having these high explosive output games, and teams and leagues slowly started putting a defense that we didn't see for a while when the high Tampa 2 slowing down the explosive plays, where now teams are having to establish the run a little bit more, to say a cliche effect where you take away big plays, you have some underneath stuff, and you have some more running plays. However, we also don't have as many uh, workhorse running backs where they're getting 300 plus touches a year. So we
Mm.
have more of split backfields, and that from a real football sense, if you're looking at it from a real football sense, this does make a lot of sense with how teams are operating, because you have players that are hopefully staying healthier. And I understand this is after a week where we still saw a lot of major players go down with injury. Christian McCaffrey is again injured, and we hope he is back for this week for those managers that have him. But if he's not, then he's yet another um, he's yet another injury we have for this season. But I think there's some things we can learn from this. We're now at week 7, and draft time is over. It's been over for now about 6 weeks, now 7 weeks, but we have to kind of let go of the past and what our past thoughts were about what teams were in the previous year, what teams are, and look at what is actually going on, where scoring's down, teams are adjusting, defenses are playing up, and we have to then build going forward. What does that look like for our fantasy teams? How does that play into it? Is Philadelphia, they are one where if I look at the team, they, yes, only have one loss, but going into that game against the Jets, they were still looking for their identity. If you looked at them on film, on paper, they still have a juggernaut of an offense. They're led by a very talented quarterback that can do everything when needed, when called upon. They have very capable playmakers, and they're utilizing some of them very effectively. And yet we're not seeing the production. AJ Brown started out slow, but in the past 2-3 weeks, he has caught on fire. But that has lowered the production of Devonta Smith and also Dallas Goedert. So were we wrong in assuming that Devonta Smith would be this elite producer yet again within that same system? But while those explosive plays are down, they're also yet turning out DeAndre Swift, not Devonta Smith, but DeAndre Swift. And he is then what we all thought he wanted to be, or what we all wanted him to be when he was in Detroit. So that just a matter of situation? And I would say probably not just a matter of situation, but it is also part of how teams are playing, where explosive plays are down, more opportunity for a game running and more plays underneath, more running opportunities, which now they are taking advantage of that. So we're seeing the shift in kind of how the players are being used, what the offenses look like going forward. Though, if Philadelphia is not able to find their identity, and we all remember the crazy fun times of Brady and Belichick running through the East, they would at times have a very shaky September where it was kind of like clockwork every year. Well, is this the last year? And come December, January, and they are again taking the division title for the AFC East and then make a Super Bowl run. So we're past the time now where is this team still searching for their identity? If they are, I would say those teams that are searching for their identity, and I'm using Philadelphia as an example, but there are other teams that you could use as an example, Cincinnati being one, although they were plagued with injuries to Joe Burrow, and they still are, but Kansas City also being another one. But the teams that are still searching for their identity, they have to find it soon. Otherwise, I would say they are going to disappoint later on because they haven't found that. Where on the contrast, you have a team where I think they did find their identity with San Francisco early on, and they have their identity, but yet they did lose because, again, it's injuries, how it's being played. But our thought isn't necessarily that this team is then just super undefeated. They can't be defeated because obviously they were. But some of the players that they have, and I'll specifically use Brock Purdy as an example. If you liked him last year, he was kind of the savior of your fantasy team potentially down the stretch. He led the 49ers back out to another potential an NFC championship run before he got hurt. So if you liked Purdy, you believed in him back then, this last loss, you see him do all he can despite having some high playmakers get injured, and he can do no wrong. The kicker should have made the field goal. However, if you were not on Brock Purdy and you still have your doubts because he is a round 7 draft pick, he was the last person taken in the draft last year. He can't do anything right. He won't ever be able to live up to the high expectation that he has already achieved, where he has superseded expectations being a last pick, where I think we have to come to terms on he may not be the next Tom Brady, where he is setting the world on fire with so many records, but he is also not a bust because he is doing things that a lot of quarterbacks aren't able to do. And if it's the system, that's great because on contrast to Philadelphia, San Francisco has found their rhythm. They found who they are. They have their identity and they're playing well within it. And so now it's a matter of how do they not peak too early, where potentially a team like Miami, are they peaking too early that they're going to run out of steam? So all of that being said, it sounds like I'm not trying to put everything together, but I think we're at the point now going forward with our fantasy teams to say, are we willing to see things how they are and potentially going forward, or are we going to hold on to a previous bias that we've had with players, teams, situations to know what's the best way to move forward with this? So, long kind of winded answer of what I potentially saw and learned in week 6, but don't know your thoughts on that, Grant, as we kind of look back to look ahead.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I think that this year, like you mentioned, more than others, scoring is down, and so I think we have a tendency as fantasy managers to draft players based on the team, based upon the name, based upon production last year. Frankly, most of us don't have the time to really delve into the analytics and say, all these, you're looking at all the different lineup changes for everybody, and in the moment in the draft, you don't have that information ready, and so you pick it based
Yep.
upon the name, the team, whatever. And I think a lot of people are disappointed, right? Like, if you drafted wide receiver twos this year, as like your go-to strategy. So if you, for example, went after Waddle or Higgins, right, thinking I'll get great value from these guys, what's happened is even though Miami, number one pass offense, number one rush offense in the NFL, you would think a wide receiver two, that team's gonna be fantastic, and it hasn't been the case. So like it's been a very weird fantasy year, and
Yep.
I think we've seen running backs graduate towards this, obviously, this running back by committee, but also receivers. We're seeing that more. We're seeing teams like Kansas City kind of put together this ragtag group of receivers, and there's not like this number one go to fantasy stud that's on the team. Yes, there are those that exist in the league, but a lot more teams are doing that for cap space, paying these big quarterbacks. So I agree with you, though. It's a weird year. And I think if you are trying to win your league and be more competitive, you have to pay more attention than you have in previous years rather than just like, oh, I'm just setting for getting my lineup. If you got a lot of players that are not those surefire lock in top 5 of their position, like Justin Jefferson before he got hurt, or a Tyreek Hill, or a Jalen Hurts, or something like that, right? Where it's such like a set it and forget it. If you don't have those kind of players, you have to play around with your lineup a little bit. And that's kind of what you mentioned is if you have a player on a team that needs to find their identity, might not be getting the ball very much. I think the Dolphins are really, really good, but they are using a bunch of players in non-traditional ways, and it's different. It's different than they've done it in the past, and I think you got to pay attention to that.
Yeah, and those are good points. I mean, Waddle, we've seen him do it on low average depth of targets by getting a lot of targets. He did that his rookie year, where then in contrast, the next year he had a very high average depth of target and he got a lot fewer. But he also then, to your point, last year was also top 10 wide receiver behind
Mm-hmm.
Tyreek Hill. So the ability is there for all, but yes,
Mm-hmm.
players Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, T. Higgins were 3 that are the number 2 option on their team, but were steamed up close to a number 1 or taken before some other team's number 1 options that we may be looking back on now and saying that was probably a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one that going forward, you might say, I don't want to um, have this headache on my roster anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
no, maybe there's enough name value recognition to say I'm going to trade away from this guy to maybe go get a couple different pieces. Maybe that's a semi lower tiered wide receiver and a maybe a stash at a running back or a different position, or maybe you're have a different position of need that you can then get a little bit higher because it's,
Mm-hmm.
again, that name value where the positive is for like Waddle and Smith, I would say specifically, just because T. Higgins is already dealing with injuries himself. But Waddle and Smith, they have outs where if A.J. Brown were to get hurt, if Tyreek Hill gets hurt, and those are ifs, we
Mm-hmm.
don't wish injuries on anybody, they do become the de facto top option in their offense. So there is value with that, but it's
Mm-hmm.
risk of those outs have to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where it's been a weird fantasy year. I mean, honestly, like that's the difference. It's not been a very traditional, straightforward year. And like you mentioned before, like you have to pay more attention to like what receivers are getting targets, how running back rooms are set up, like who, like you almost have to watch the actual games. Which before you kind of cheat your way through a box score or something and say,
Yeah,
oh, I didn't watch the Panthers Broncos game. Like, man, sucks to be me, right? And then you look
right.
at the box score and then understand like, all right, Cortland Sutton had this many targets and like what happened here and to Judy and all this. You could kind of look at the box score, but now you have to pay attention to how coaches use the players, how running backs look when they have the ball, right? Like look at Jalen Warren and Najee Harris, for example, is a great
Yep.
example of that, right? Like
Yeah.
so I'd agree with you. Like it's a year where if you drafted lucky, great, right? You drafted the right players and like perfect, life's good for you. But if you are kind of on that cusp, like you kind of have to pay attention to the games and it's a good opportunity right now as we have some data points in these games to kind of figure out waiver wire acquisitions, some trades, like kind of make some moves to make your team more competitive.
Yeah. I mean, just like you said, weird year. And it's not weird, and you're not saying it's weird because of how many injuries. We've seen fantasy seasons go
Yeah.
with injuries and have lots of injuries. That's not with the weirdness, but one thing that I find weird is players that went early in the first round, you're down to one who hasn't been injured, and that's
Mhm.
Tyreek Hill. Every other player that was
Mhm.
taken early in first rounds, those teams are hurting a little bit. Jamar Chase's
Yep.
teams are underperforming because he's underperformed. He's building it back up, but when you have 3 to 4 weeks of underperformance, that kind of hurts a foundational building block. Justin Jefferson now, we hope he's not out for the season, but it's also not a positive thing. Christian
Mhm.
McCaffrey is, week to week, in my opinion, just because he may be looking on track to play, and we hope he does. But age and then his past history with injuries have to tell us that it's at least a risk.
Mhm.
And he's not going to be this, you know, 25 to 30 point producer throughout the playoffs potentially. He has less chance of that than um, he has less chance of doing that than going out and actually not being injured. So, yeah, very odd year. And yeah, like you said, you have to pay attention kind of to almost those ancillary data points that we want to look at. It's not just who gets the
Mhm.
targets, what teams are scoring lots, therefore that's who's going to get the ball. It's looking again at can we find the defensive matchups that we want to target as well as then those particular offensive pieces. So yeah,
Mhm.
great great look back, and it's good kind of to understand where we've been at and what we're learning as we kind of go through this, because we said it in draft season where it's a short data point, uh you know things that we're doing. We don't, in any job that any of us have, we don't go to our boss and say, hey, I've got, what we should do. And I have 17 points of data that show this is why we should do it. You'd be told, go get more data because that's not enough. And yet that's what we do with fantasy football is say, well, I have this points of data based on a previous season, but we do have to account for what changes. And then those are new
Mhm.
data points as well. There are some that year over year we can look at and say this is a historical trend, but it's not something that it's always sticking this way. There's no predictive point that we can go to and say this is what it's going to be. So, yeah, part of that
Mhm.
fun puzzle we all try to put together week by week now.
Yep.
So, as we do that, look ahead.
Mm-hmm.
What do
Sure.
we got this week going ahead? Looking ahead at week 7 games, Grant. What game
Mm.
piques your
Yeah.
interest this year, or this week, I should say?
Yes. So obviously, since you know, neither of us ever talk about the Chiefs or the Chargers, right? Because we have
Nope.
nothing related to those. We of course have to talk about the Chiefs and Chargers. So that's the big AFC West matchup, which a lot of people will be tuning into. But the Chargers are coming off, of course, the loss of Monday Night Football to the Cowboys, a nail-biting, frustrating, alcohol-inducing 20-17 loss, where both quarterbacks did not play exceptionally well, and the Chargers kind of showed some decent defense, or a combination of the Cowboys just being lackluster in offense, maybe a combination of both. But yeah, it was kind of a low scoring game, and Chargers have been struggling early on in the season. Kansas City has just came off a Thursday night victory over the Broncos, 19-8. Kansas City, as we kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, which has not had the super high scoring offense that we had hoped fantasy wise that would
Yep.
happen. And but as a result of real football and their defense playing lights out, they have 5-1 record. And the line right now is Kansas City 5.5 playing at Arrowhead. And the last 4 years of this series, the largest margin of victory has been 8 points. So it's been a very close series. It's I mean the Chargers have beat Kansas City in KC a couple years ago. Last year it came down to a Justin Herbert pick six to
Yep.
seal the victory for the Chiefs, and so it's gonna be a close game. Fantasy wise, I think you kind of have to look. You're gonna start their studs, right? You're gonna start Travis Kelsey as like the go-to receiver. Again, though, and I know we talk about this every week. We talk about the Chiefs, right? But like, it's so frustrating having this great quarterback and a deep but mediocre, from fantasy perspective, receiving core, which is we don't know who is going to get the yards. Is it Rashi Rice? Is it Sky Moore? Like, are the running backs going to get balls? Right? We don't know. Now, real football perspective, right? We talked about it's working for the Chiefs, right? They're not scoring as many points per game as they normally do, but they're winning games. Fantasy wise, though, it makes a lot of these a lot of Chiefs players just completely unstartable, and you're basically throwing a dart at a dartboard, hoping and praying that there's a 70-yard Mahomes deep shot that goes to someone. What will be interesting is McCole Hardman, as of 10/18, 2023,
Yes.
has
As of
joined the Chiefs,
today, again.
right?
Yes.
As of today, coming from the Jets, where he spent all of half a year playing, and now he is back in Kansas City. So it will be interesting to see the next few weeks what happens if he becomes like the wide receiver one with the chemistry he's had with Mahomes. Um, it'll be interesting to see. The Chiefs definitely needed to make some moves. I don't know if it's going to be enough to make him this go-to flex or wide receiver 2 or 3 in your lineup every week. You'll have to just stash him on your bench. But it's definitely a worthwhile play. At this point, waivers are, you've seen data points. The high performers from the first few games, Puka, other individuals that you've picked as a receiver are off the waivers, right? So now you're kind of scrounging. So if he's available, McCole Hardman may or may not be available. If you have rolling waivers, then you'll probably someone's grabbed them already because they are on their phone at work. But if you have like a hard reset every day with your waiver wires, maybe you can snag them tonight and just kind of see what happens. But it's definitely a good option if you want to pursue that. Uh, but yeah, that's kind of what the Chiefs are. So like, obviously you want to, I would say, of course, Patrick Mahomes. I would personally probably flex Pacheco personally right now, and then Travis Kelsey. The rest of the Chiefs, even though the Chargers don't have the best defense, I think they're ranked 28 out of 32. The problem is that it's a divisional game, and these guys always play close. And I don't know if the Chiefs are. I think the Chiefs are going to be trying to control the ball more, which is how their defense has led them. That's the style of team that has been what's been presented each week has been defense has led the team, and the offense has kind of guided. I mean, the defense kind of guided the offense, right? Which is like, hey, we've been controlling the clock. We're keeping them off the field. We need you guys to like chew some clock down and like just get some points and like field goals and touchdowns intermittently. So that's of course also Butker too for a kicker, but yeah, and then for Chiefs defense, I know it was a hot pick for the Broncos last week. Playing an elite quarterback like Justin Herbert, I think there are better options if you are desperate and you must keep the Chiefs defense. It's not the worst play in the world, but against Justin Herbert, I don't really love starting defenses because he is normally an efficient quarterback if he has time to throw the ball, and if the
Yep.
Chiefs can't put a lot of pressure on him, then he can tear them up. So I would say play Chiefs defense at your own risk. The Broncos are the Broncos, so obviously the Chiefs defense scored well last week, but again, if you're in a short bench and you can't rotate defenses, you don't have another one. It's not the worst play in Kansas City, but again, just be prepared for. I mean, a good quarterback could potentially just ruin your defense. On the Chargers side of the ball, or sorry, do you have any comments before I move on to the Chargers? Jeff?
Yeah, a couple here. So you bring up some good points
Mm-hmm.
with Kansas City. So if there's a stretch for a Kansas City wide receiver to break out,
Mm-hmm.
it is during this stretch of games that they have. They did not have really a huge breakout game with the wide receiver against Denver,
Mm-hmm.
but I that game kind of looked like Kansas City was trying to see what they had. It was not. I'm not going to say I've
Mm-hmm.
heard the term they were out there practicing. I'm not going to say they were practicing, but I don't think they were showing fully what they could do. Now that's personal opinion. That's not. I've not talked with anybody within the organization or anybody like that, so I have no idea. It's just my what I see on paper. I will say in 3 wide receiver sets where I think adding Hardman, I think helps kind of muddy the water when it comes to Kadarius Toney type plays. Kadarius Toney has not really remained healthy, but Hardman also adds an element of speed that the team doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have anymore and that they've lost. And I do think they miss having that speed element where you can take, again, this goes back to the comments we were making before of explosive plays are down. You're not getting the over the top bombs to wide receivers like you were before. So having a wide receiver like Hardman, where that wasn't his bread and butter when he was with Kansas City, that was Hill. But you have yet another wide receiver that if Kelsey is sitting in his zone or is doubled, can take a short pass but turn it into 25 yards pretty quick just because of the speed element of it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all Kansas City fans will close their eyes when McCole Hardman has the ball because we all hope he doesn't fumble. That being aside, um, in 3 wide receiver sets, though, I think Kansas City is also building something that we haven't really seen in the past few years, but a lot of the catch or the run after the catch type of plays. And I say that seeing the last game, I think we will see Rashi Rice. Again, personal opinion on this, but I think we will see Rashi Rice continue to step up. He had 4 targets against Denver. He turned that into 72 yards, didn't get the score. He was also third in snap percentage, where if you look at the snap percentage by receiver for Kansas City, the highest snap percentage is Marcus Valdes-Scantling, but he was at 52%.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else was below the 50% mark, where it was MVS, then Justin Watson, who was at a 49%. Then it was Rashi Rice at a 42%. And then after that, it was Kadarius Toney. So it's one of those you can't trust them just because they're not on the field for 60+% of the
Mm-hmm.
plays. Travis Kelce led them, but he was only on the field for 69% of the plays. But this week being a bye-mageddon week where we have 6 teams on bye, if you have Rashi Rice, you have MVS, especially with now Justin
Mm-hmm.
Watson dealing with a wrist injury, the Chargers per game to wide receiver rank second last by, this is a per game, not a total, but per game. Actually, they rank last against wide receivers, giving up over 230 yards to receivers. So this would be the week to do it if you need a potential boom, knowing that the targets are limited, like you were saying. Hardman
Mm-hmm.
potentially provides that, but I would also say then
Mm-hmm.
Rice, or in a very deep league if you have MVS. Those would be the plays of like
Mm-hmm.
you could do it if you needed to fill it for this week. So
Yeah, and you bring up good points. Like the Chargers overall by passing yards have the worst defense in the NFL, right? So
right,
they give up almost 290 pass yards per game. So obviously those are the first few games where they played
sure,
Miami, so that's not
yep,
ever helpful to a team's defense. But still, there's enough data points there. And they played 5 games to understand that they are susceptible in the pass game. So I think I agree with you. Like if you have Rice, if you have a ton of buys that are happening, if you've got Cowboys players, I mean, anybody else,
yep,
right? Like just a lot of missing pieces. Then it's not a bad idea if you want to flex them and get some production.
yep. You may not
All
like it,
right.
but close your eyes and do it.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. All right. So quickly talk about the Chargers real fast. So Chargers side of the ball. Herbert has been a great fantasy quarterback up through the season. I believe he's quarterback number 4 as of Monday night's game. I think he was number 2 before that. So, he had 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. Overall, has done well on the year. He's got 9 touchdowns, 2 interceptions for the year, 1,300 yards. So through 5 games, that's pretty good for fantasy wise. That's about as ideal as you want it to go. And especially too with you drafted him, right? You drafted him probably lower than a Hurts and a Mahomes and a Burrow. So getting good production, I think, for the value from where his spot is. Um, for the rest of the team, Eckler came back from injury, as everyone who drafted him in the first round was painfully aware. He scored about 25 fantasy points his first game, then was injured, sat out through the bye week they had last week, and finally played against the Cowboys again. Had about 8.5 fantasy points. Didn't rush the ball exceptionally well. Had 14 rushes. Caught a handful of balls and turned those into his classic, 5, 6, 7 yard gains. But overall, did not do well. And I think that is a little bit the result of the game script and just the pressure on Herbert. They
Mhm.
weren't able to get into a rhythm with the offense, but I expect Eckler to get back into more of a groove. Also, it's his first game back. He's kind of going 100% the first time. Unfortunately for him, he's running into a Kansas City defense that has done very well. They are ranked 6th overall in total yards in the NFL, the 6th best team. They don't allow they just don't allow a lot of yards. So the Chargers are going to have to really earn everything they have. I'm thinking that Eckler's not going to have a lot of success rushing the ball. His fantasy yards are going to be on dump offs and short yardage plays as the Chiefs defend the receivers down the field. So if you have Eckler in full point or half point PPR, I think he's going to do substantially better than a standard league. Right now, the Chiefs are giving up about 100 rush yards a game, is what the average is, but I don't think that just the way the Chargers' offensive line has held up, the Chiefs have played some decent teams. I don't think that the Chargers are going to run for 100 yards. I think it's going to be less than that, and I think Herbert's going to be running around for most of the game. Back to real fast, just touching on the Chargers players. We don't need to talk about Keenan Allen. That's obviously a must
Right.
start. Um, Going for kind of what you mentioned, like the Rashi Rice type of, MBS type of play for the Chargers. Joshua Palmer had 7 targets, caught 4 balls for 60 yards. Same situation as Rashi Rice. I think if you have him on your team, in most leagues, he's probably picked up because Mike Williams went down with injury, and most teams wanted to fill that wide receiver 2 spot, especially when Herbert was throwing the ball really well the first few weeks of the season.
Yep.
So he's probably taken up in most leagues, but if you happen to have him, um, 7 targets last game against Dallas defense for 60 yards. He has kind of taken over that number 2 spot very well. Should be fighting with Eckler for that second, for the most targets on the team behind Keenan Allen. So
Right.
I think if you do have him, just I would definitely flex him if you have him, just because of the game script. I don't expect Kansas City to give much to the Chargers, so I expect them to be throwing the ball around a lot. And I will say, as talking about the Chargers, Quentin Johnson, I was high on him at the start of the season, and this is one where I'll eat my words. He has not panned out well. I don't think the Chargers are using him well, but also he's caught 6 balls for 44 yards right on the season. So
Yep.
he hasn't been used well, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know enough about football to know if it's something like a personality thing the coaches don't like, or just the way the routes are. Herbert in those panic moments is like, I need to look at Josh Palmer, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, and I don't know, right? I don't know enough. I'm not enough of a football guru, but what I've seen on the field is he's getting the third, the fourth look from Herbert, never really getting targeted when it comes down to a crucial third down position, which is what you want the quarterback to look at the receiver for, right? You want him to be a read where you can look at him, someone where it's reliable, and it just hasn't, the chemistry has not developed. I can't say he's a bust yet because, again, we've seen plenty of times a receiver who's a rookie finally gets some snaps going, he gets into a rhythm, he gets confident, and he takes off the rest of the year. I don't know yet, but if you have him, man, I don't know if he's worth a bench spot at this point. I mean, maybe you keep him as a deep stash if you have like a, obviously a dynasty league, you keep him, right, but in some kind of redraft league, he's a deep bench spot slash drop. Yeah, that's kind of the summary on the Chargers players. Like we don't, I mean, I think that their lineup is pretty self-explanatory at this point. Um, and for this game, I think it's gonna be a lower scoring 24-21 type of game. And I'm thinking the Chiefs defense is gonna force the Chargers into more of a passing game script.
Yeah. If no, and I would agree with that because Casey Chargers, they always play close divisional games. Anything's bound to happen. These are teams that they know
Mm-hmm.
each other very well, and the Chargers typically have matched up very well against Kansas City. So, despite all of that, it's who knows what it's going to be. It's going to be anybody's game. I think it's going to come down to it. Now, Kansas City, like you said, Chargers will have a lot greater test this year against the defense that
Mm-hmm.
Kansas State's putting out there because also they get defensive end Charles, and I forget his name, the player that they signed from the 49ers. He is off from suspension and able to play this year, so that adds another depth piece to an already pretty stout defensive line for Kansas City. So I would agree with you on, yes, you're starting Herbert, you're going to start Eckler, you're starting Keenan Allen. At this point, if you have Josh Palmer, he is definitely worth an add as that number 2 role because I think
Mm-hmm.
this offense for the Chargers ran better with Mike Williams just because of the type of route runner he was and the ability to get those deep targets that Palmer just isn't the same type of wide receiver. He does just fine, but it's just not the same as when Mike Williams was running it. And part of that may be matchup based early on in the season, the types of teams you're able to get that more. Part of it also is personnel, I think. And yeah, we'll see if Quentin Johnson, obviously, yes, you can't call him a bust. I was a little worried. You had very high optimism in the beginning of the year. I was a little more worried
Yeah.
about him in the beginning of the year, but that's part of the fun of this is we can take different sides of it. And I can't victory lap it yet because I was this year on Sky Moore, and he is, if I'm going to say Quentin Johnson's a bust, Sky Moore is also a bust because he's not done anything. This is his second year with Kansas City. So
Mm.
I hope the Chargers can. I think you're right. He is not being utilized in a way that we saw him use at TCU, and is that a case of his game style just hasn't translated to the NFL well? Is it the Chargers don't have a system that enhances what he does? Or is it just doesn't translate and we don't know? It's a personnel thing like you mentioned. So I think we'll see. But yeah, I think if nothing else, it should be a fun game. But I also agree we should be ready for a fun,
Mm,
competitive, lower scoring game, not in the 30s
mm,
and 40s scoring. So obviously, if it was that, we would all love it. But yeah, I don't think it will be that way this coming Sunday. So, but going into week 7, we preview a game, and there's obviously other games that are well worth it. We kind of touched a little bit on Eagles Dolphins. We didn't really go through the game that well, but that also could be another fun game going into this week as well. But there are 7 teams on bye this week, Grant. We've got
mm.
Carolina, Cincinnati, Dallas, Houston, the Jets, and Tennessee. And while some of those aren't very usable, friendly fantasy offenses, there are still pieces within those that people are missing. So, in a
Mm.
week where we have, 7 different teams on bye, any thoughts on how you look at roster construction with trying to
Mm.
replace and not replace? Because if you have CeeDee Lamb, you have Jamar Chase, a guy like Rashi Rice doesn't replace that. But how do you look at these weeks of knowing I'm losing a high value asset, but how can I then
Mm.
not take the loss during this bye week? What do I need to look at?
Yeah, good point. I mean, there's kind of several different strategies, and I'll probably do one. You can talk about the other one, but one is like you say, screw it, and when you're drafting players, you just draft who falls to you, and you don't really look
Yep.
at bye weeks, so then you just kind of hope and pray at the end that it works out. And normally, you're not going to draft more than like 2 players from the same team normally, so you can obviously figure that out for that bye week from that team, but um, that's the first strategy is just kind of not really caring. But then when you get down to it though, and you got Mageddon, you got a lot of players. That's where having a bench of some substance comes into play. You might be starting, you know, a Latavius Murray, right? That might
Right.
be the running back that you put in, right? And while Pollard's on the bench or something like that. So but the thing is having some kind of some player who has some value and not just a backup. You don't want a backup that obviously those are very valuable, but you want to have a bench that you hopefully have distributed enough of your players where you have probably a quarterback, running back or two, wide receiver or two, a tight end, however your league's constructed. But that's the reason for the bench right there. Obviously, it's injuries, but it's to have some serviceable players where you have either traded for them or you've hunted the waiver wire where you have something. Now, obviously, you're not starting them, so in the first place, so that's why they're on the bench. But you need to have something there where they can kind of take over, and also too another a little bit information is knowing when your bye week's going to happen. So don't be week 6, after waivers. You're like, oh great, week 7's coming up, perfect. You look around and all of a sudden week 6 game's clear and it's today, it's Wednesday or Tuesday, and all of a sudden you're like, oh crap, I've got 5 guys on bye, and you're having to hunt the waivers after all the players are gone. Like you need to be thinking about it 2 and 3 weeks beforehand of like, all right, I've got these players on bye. Like, what's going to happen? Do I need to trade with someone? Like, fantasy football, the key is obviously you get lucky with who you play, right? The other
Sure.
team, you can't control that, but you got to make your team as consistent as possible, and that's where you can sneak out a win or two during buy them again. But maybe you have another strategy or another thought process of how you do that.
I think you hit on several key things I think are important where, um, during the draft process, I don't take bye weeks into as much consideration as potentially some where I know roster construction early on, because I know by week 6, 7, my team may look very different just because injuries or whatever, what have you, that I don't want to save from week one. Well, I can't have too many players on buys at the same time. But to your point, if you then have 5 people on buy all at the same time, that really hurts 1 week, which if
Mm-hmm.
you're struggling, 1 week could then really hurt in the long run of I'm already struggling. So I think the biggest thing is to look at, again, what we've talked about earlier is what are those ancillary trend pieces that we
Mm-hmm.
can see where I can take advantage a week or two early, where I know whether this running back is on waivers, and in 2 weeks when there's buys for my team, he's already, this particular player is trending towards being a better player than what he's been doing, and he has a very favorable matchup. Say it's Denver, who's playing Green Bay. Now, obviously, you're not necessarily able to get Aaron Jones or Christian Watson, or even at this point Luke Musgrave on on waivers, but a guy like Jaden Reed is on waivers, and if you are wide receiver needy, there's an opportunity there where Denver has a very pitiful pass defense, and Jaden Reed has still had value where yeah, you also mentioned, a guy like Latavius Murray, where we've seen the past couple weeks his role kind of expand. So, um, and now with the Damian Harris injury, that role actually continues to span. Where it's one of those, I think we have to have the understanding where, yep, I'm not going to get my Tony Pollard potential line, but there's upside there that then I'm not going to then potentially lose my week because I have too many buys. I also think actually a pretty good strategy is look who players are dropping. If you're not facing a pretty heavy bye week this week and you have some room on your bench, maybe it's a deep bench or maybe you just have a spot or two that you're able to wiggle around, look at the players who are going into their bye. They're not going to be
Mm.
targeted on waivers this week. A specific name that I'll throw out is Devin Singletary with Houston. They are on bye this week, and he has seen his usage increase where there could be kind of a shifting from Damian Pierce being the lead back to more of a committee or Singletary's more utilized. So even if you're a Christian McCaffrey owner or you have another running back that potentially is injured or very underperforming, that going out of this bye weeks for them, but you want to build some depth. Those are the players then to look at. Say I can hold this guy for a roster spot, not have to, whether it's waiver fab or it's priority ads. You don't have to use one of those necessarily
Mm.
because it's a week away. So if you're thinking a week away, that would be where whether you're heading into the bye, think a week or two away, going into other teams' buys, look who's on the waiver wire that actually may going out of the bye potentially help your team as well. So that would be kind of my thought. Where you see it's a week by week thing, but it's one of those we have to take each week and see how things adjust. um so if you're holding a handcuff and you really can't afford to hold a handcuff, replace it with somebody that has potential, knowing that you have to be willing to just rotate through some of your back end roster guys, but
Mm.
sometimes those guys will hit and they hit at the right time potentially. So a little bit of luck with that. So but okay, well, anybody that on the waiver wire this week that kind of catches your interest? I know waivers have
Mm.
kind of already passed, and we kind of touched on them a little bit now. But
Mm-hmm.
any particular ones that maybe potentially flying under the radar that we should be looking at this week?
Under the radar. Well, I'll do one that's like above the radar, or sorry,
Sure,
in the on the radar, right? That's the
on the radar. Yeah,
obvious one.
yeah,
I think the biggest one, of course, is Zach Evans. That has to be the big one for this week. And I'm sure, as I'm saying this, every league he's pretty much picked up in, unless you have
sure.
it's a home league with your grandparents or something, then maybe not. But normally he's gonna be picked up with Kyron Williams missing at least a few weeks on the injury report. So I think that with how McVay uses running backs, I think that that's a very serviceable player, especially too if you have saved some of your fab or you have your waiver spot that you want to use and you are in need of a running back on by Mageddon. It's not a bad spot to be in. I think a couple of I've mentioned one player already on this, and I'll mention another one too. Um, Kareem Hunt, I think,
Yep.
is kind of carving out the veteran role. He scored a touchdown on Sunday. He is carving out a role on the Browns offense yet again. I think I don't know. We'll see how they use him. It'll probably be a tandem system with Ford. I doubt that they're going to let Kareem Hunt just come and take over. But again, if you need someone for Bimageddon, and this is a situation where it's like I at this point think about the Browns coaching staff. They know Kareem Hunt. They know what he's capable of. Right? He has experience. He's a veteran. All these things. So
Yep.
guess who's getting the ball first and goal from the two, him or the rookie. Let's be honest,
Right.
right? That's what's going to happen. So, like, it's not the worst pickup. It's not the worst play, especially if you need someone. I mentioned this for the receiver, McCole Hardman. Uh,
Yep.
Definitely a stash. I don't know if it's a play this week because he obviously has just got to the team and probably knows the playbook decently well, but still needs to be caught up. That's definitely a stash, and see how that happens next few weeks. But those are kind of my three. I'm sure you also have a couple as well.
Yeah, and I will say for one, if you're needing somebody this week, he might be picked up already if waivers ran, but Craig Reynolds out of Detroit,
Mm,
Jameer Gibbs was limited at practice again with the hamstring, and yes, when David Montgomery was out earlier in the season, Gibbs saw about 60% of the rush share, but
mm,
Reynolds is also then he kind of takes that David Montgomery light work. It's not pretty, but if especially Gibbs has any setbacks, you're then looking at a running back who, yeah, he's more of the average running back, but he is then splitting with Zonovan Knight, who also is injured, but there's back end RB2 potential with Reynolds, even with Gibbs potentially playing. So they're also added, and I don't necessarily need to mention them, but I will just because we've already hit on CMC, but both Elijah Mitchell and Jordan Mason should be added. If either of those are not added, then
mm,
you should pick them up because Mitchell's not a prospect of health, but Mason did see the bulk of the work last week against Cleveland when CMC went down. So those two for running backs. As far as wide receivers would go, um, in some shallow leagues, I would look at a guy like Josh Downs with Indianapolis. The floor kind of is a little bit lower with the season ender for Anthony Richardson, but he has that speed aspect to the game that they have in Indy. So I would still say it's he's that wide receiver two in Indianapolis behind Michael Thomas, or not Michael Thomas, Michael Pittman. So
mm,
yeah, he had a touchdown in the last game, and they have a pretty decent schedule coming up. Um, Jaden Reed, I kind of mentioned him before, but um, he's coming off their bye week, and he did not get utilized any less after Christian Watson came back from injury the last game that they played. So I think there's going to be a squeeze out of Romeo Doubs, but I think Reed is going to take over that wide receiver two in Green Bay. So if he was dropped, I would say go pick him up because he has shown consistent work as a rookie and could potentially still have that going forward. So kind of just high level there, but Yeah, and if you want to really just have some fun with tight end, go just plug in Taysom Hill and to say just
Mm,
screw the tight end position, and we're gonna have fun with this. And in all seriousness, though, he did see an increase in tight end work last week
yep, did.
with New Orleans. So on one hand, it's kind of this screw the position, but on the other hand, I mean, there's some legitimate to it potentially this week too. So
I agree with you. Yeah, it's an interesting week, and like you said, you can get desperate and you start playing Taysom Hill at tight end, and things always get a little funny.
yep, a little bit funny there. So all
Hmm.
right, kind of wrap up here. Any final thoughts as we head towards a fun, lower scoring week 7, as we should anticipate?
I guess my only comment is just, like you mentioned before, watch the bye weeks. There's bye weeks from now until, I mean, they start in week 5, but they really hit hard the next few weeks. So, I mean, you want to pay attention to your team. Either figure out a strategy, either commit to going all in on the bye week and your team is not great, or try to move some pieces around and really play it to keep yourself competitive. But keep in mind that games won here matter all of a sudden week 13 and 14 when you're a game out or you need your more points for to get into the last playoff round or something like that. Like, it matters. So don't just mail it in. Like, try to make an effort because every point can matter at the end of the season.
Yep. Nope, that's good to keep in mind. And I think we have at least one more heavy bye week. I forget what week that is, but I think there's one more. So be ready for that. And hopefully you're able to use some of the tips from this week if you weren't able to go into this week into the next week. So with that, we'll look ahead to week 7 and we'll hopefully be back to look ahead to week 8 and kind of review from week 7. But until then, we will see everyone next time.